They thought humiliating her would be the highlight of the night, but they had no idea they were standing on the edge of their own embarrassment. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, make sure to like and subscribe, because stories like this remind us who really holds the power now. Back to Emily Carter, the mansion stood like a glowing monument on the hills. Just outside the city, its glass walls, reflecting the soft golden lights of luxury cars pulling in one after another. Guests stepped out in tailored suits and designer gowns, heels clicking against polished stone, as laughter floated through the warm evening air. Inside the grand hall, crystal chandeliers shimmered above marble floors, and a live jazz band played softly in the background. Servers moved gracefully, with trays of champagne, weaving between clusters of well-dressed elites who spoke in low, confident tones about investments, art, and influence. This was Victoria Hayes' world, a place where status was currency and appearances were everything. At exactly 8:12 p.m., the double doors opened again. But this time the rhythm of the room shifted slightly. Emily Carter stepped inside alone. Her dress was simple black, no designer label, no glitter, no attempt to impress. Her hair pulled back neatly, her presence quiet, almost invisible, and yet something about her made a few heads turn, not with admiration, but with curiosity, the kind that quickly turned into judgment. Whispers began almost instantly, soft at first, then spreading like ripples across the room. Who is she? Someone asked under their breath. Another voice followed. She looks lost. A faint laugh slipped through a group near the bar. Emily paused, just for a moment, taking in the room, her eyes steady, not intimidated, not impressed, just observing, as if she had seen places like this before and found nothing new in them. Across the room, Victoria Hayes noticed her immediately, standing near the center, surrounded by guests who leaned in to catch her every word. Victoria was the kind of woman who never had to raise her voice to be heard. Her presence commanded attention effortlessly. Her silver gown shimmered under the lights, her posture flawless, her smile sharp and controlled. But when her eyes landed on Emily, that smile shifted just slightly into something colder, something calculating. She leaned toward one of her friends, whispering just loud enough for others nearby to hear. Did someone invite her? Or did she just wander in? The group chuckled softly, their eyes now fixed on Emily, as if she had become part of the evening's entertainment. Victoria took a slow sip of champagne, then set the glass aside, already deciding how this would play out. Tonight wasn't just another party, it was a gathering of people who mattered, and in her world, someone like Emily Carter didn't belong, and Victoria was about to make sure everyone knew it. The music continued, the lights sparkled, and across the room, Emily stood quietly, unaware to them, but not to us, that every word, every glance, every quiet insult was leading to a moment none of them were prepared for. Because sometimes the person you dismiss the fastest is the one who holds the power to silence an entire room. Victoria did not rush. She never rushed, because in her world, control was everything, and moments like this were meant to be savored. She moved slowly through the crowd, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, each step deliberate, each glance calculated. As conversations faded around her, guests instinctively shifted, making space without being asked, because when Victoria Hayes decided to focus on someone, the entire room followed her attention like gravity. Emily remained where she was, near the edge of the grand hall, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm, as if the whispers drifting around her did not exist, but they did exist, and they were growing louder, now no longer hidden behind polite smiles. One woman leaned toward her companion and murmured loud enough to be heard, "This is embarrassing." Another man shook his head quietly, saying, "There is always someone who tries to slip in where they do not belong." The air carried a subtle tension, the kind that precedes a spectacle. Victoria finally stopped just a few feet from Emily, tilting her head slightly, as if examining something unusual. Her smile returned, but it was no longer warm. It was sharp, polished like glass. "I do not believe we have met," she said, her voice smooth, but carrying easily across the surrounding crowd. Emily met her gaze without hesitation, her eyes steady, almost unreadable. "Emily Carter," she replied simply, her tone neither defensive nor apologetic. Victoria repeated the name slowly, as if testing it. "Emily Carter, and who exactly invited you tonight?" The question hung in the air, not really a question, but a challenge. Several guests turned fully now, their attention locked in place, waiting. Emily paused for a brief second, not out of uncertainty, but as if deciding how much to say. "I was told this event was open to selected guests," she answered calmly. Victoria let out a soft laugh, shaking her head, slightly selected being the key word. She replied, her voice lifting just enough for more people to hear. This is not the kind of gathering you simply walk into without knowing someone important to ripple off. Quiet amusement spread through the crowd. Someone whispered, she is bold, I will give her that. Another voice added, or clueless Victoria took a small step closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound personal, while still performing for everyone watching. I think there has been a misunderstanding, she said sweetly. This evening is reserved for individuals who are part of a certain circle. Her eyes briefly scanned Emily from head to toe, not cruelly, but deliberately, as if making a point. And I am afraid you do not seem to fit that description. The words landed softly, but the meaning was unmistakable. A few guests smiled into their glasses. Others watched with open curiosity, waiting to see how Emily would react. Because in rooms like this, reactions were everything. Emily, however, did not react the way they expected. She did not blush or stumble over her words. She did not shrink under the attention. Instead, she remained completely still, her posture unchanged, her gaze unwavering, as if Victoria's words had passed right through her like air. That subtle stillness created something unexpected, a faint hesitation in the room, a quiet shift that no one could quite explain. Victoria noticed it too, and for the briefest moment something flickered in her expression. Irritation perhaps, or the slightest hint of uncertainty, but she pushed it aside, quickly doubling down on her control. I will have someone escort you out, she said now more firmly, lifting her hand slightly to signal one of the staff nearby. The guard began moving toward them, his steps measured, professional. The music continued, but softer now, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Conversations had nearly stopped completely, all eyes fixed on the unfolding scene, waiting for the inevitable conclusion, because in their minds this story had already been written. The outsider would be removed, the balance restored, the night would continue as if nothing had happened. But what none of them realized, not Victoria, not the guests, not even the guard approaching, was that Emily Carter was not standing there by accident, and the silence building in that moment was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something none of them were prepared to face. The guard was only a few steps away when something subtle shifted, not in the room, but in Emily herself. Not fear, not hesitation, but a quiet decision. Her fingers moved slightly, brushing against the small clutch in her hand, as if confirming something only she understood. Her eyes lifted, briefly scanning the room, not the people, not the judgment, but the structure, the walls, the chandeliers, the space itself, as if she recognized it in a way none of them did. The guard cleared his throat. Politely, ma'am, I am going to have to ask you to step outside, his tone professional, but firm, the kind that expected compliance. Without question, a few guests exchanged knowing looks. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the inevitable exit, the quiet removal, the restoration of order. Victoria folded her arms lightly, satisfaction returning to her expression as she watched the scene unfold exactly as she had intended. You see, she said softly to those nearest to her, her voice carrying just enough. This is what happens when boundaries are not respected. A couple of guests nodded, murmuring agreement. One woman even smiled faintly, as if the situation had been resolved before it truly began. But Emily did not move. She did not argue. She did not resist. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward the guard, her expression calm, almost thoughtful. Give me just a moment, she said, her voice even and composed. The guard hesitated just briefly, not because of her words, but because of how she said them. There was no desperation, no embarrassment, only certainty. Victoria noticed the pause immediately, her eyes narrowing just slightly. I am afraid there is nothing to wait for, she replied, stepping forward again, her tone sharpening. This is a private event, and I have already made it clear you are not welcome. The music in the background seemed distant now, as if the entire room had leaned into this single exchange. Conversations had stopped completely. Glasses were held midair, eyes fixed on Emily, waiting for her to finally break, to apologize, to leave. But instead she reached into her clutch and pulled out a small card, simple, unremarkable at first glance. She held it for a second, then extended it toward the guard. He took it instinctively, his eyes dropping to read the name printed across the surface, and in that instant something changed. His posture straightened, his expression shifted from routine authority to something else, something closer to uncertainty. He looked back at Emily, then again at the card, as if confirming what he was seeing was real. Victoria noticed the shift immediately. What is it? She asked, her tone edged with impatience. The guard did not answer right away. His voice, when it came, was lower, less certain. Ma'am, I think there may be some confusion. Victoria frowned, stepping closer, her confidence still intact, but now tinged with confusion. "There is no confusion," she said firmly. "She should not be here." The guard glanced once more at the card, then at Emily, and for the first time since approaching, he seemed unsure of what to do. Guests leaned in slightly, sensing the tension change like a current shifting direction. One man whispered, "What is going on?" Another shook his head quietly as if something no longer added up. Emily said nothing. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her breathing, even allowing the moment to stretch just long enough for the discomfort to grow, for the certainty in the room to begin to crack, because what they were starting to feel was not sympathy, not curiosity, but doubt, and doubt in a room built on confidence was the most dangerous thing of all. Victoria reached out her hand abruptly. "Give that to me," she said. The guard hesitated just a fraction of a second before passing the card to her. She glanced at it quickly, her eyes scanning the name, and whatever she read did not register. At first her expression remained unchanged, but then slowly, almost imperceptibly, her smile faded, the color in her face shifted, and for the briefest moment something unfamiliar crossed her eyes. Not anger, not control, but realization, the kind that arrives too late, the kind that cannot be undone. And around them the room fell into a silence so complete it felt as if even the air had stopped moving, because something was about to happen, something that would change the way every person in that room remembered this night forever. Victoria's fingers tightened slightly around the card as if the thin piece of paper had suddenly gained weight. Her eyes moved across the printed name again, slower this time, more carefully, and the shift in her expression became impossible to hide. The confidence that had defined her presence all evening began to fracture just at the edges, not enough for everyone to see, but enough for those closest to notice the subtle change. One of her friends leaned in, whispering, "What does it say?" But Victoria did not respond immediately. She was still reading, still processing, because the name on that card did not belong to someone who should have been standing quietly at the edge of the room, being dismissed like an inconvenience. It belonged to someone far beyond, that someone whose presence alone could redefine the entire hierarchy of the night. The guard stood still, now no longer attempting to escort anyone out. His posture had changed completely, his shoulders straighter, his gaze no longer dismissive, but attentive, waiting for instruction that he was no longer certain would come from Victoria. The silence stretched longer, heavier, the kind that makes people shift uncomfortably in place. Glasses were lowered, conversations forgotten, as every pair of eyes remained locked on the center of the room, where something invisible but undeniable was unfolding. Victoria finally lifted her head, her eyes meeting Emily's again, but this time there was something different in them, something uncertain, something cautious, as if she were no longer entirely sure who she was standing in front of. "This is not possible," she said quietly, though her voice still carried through the silence. Emily did not react. She simply watched her, calm, composed, as she had been from the moment she entered the room, as if this outcome had never been in doubt, as if everything happening now was exactly as it should be. Victoria glanced back down at the card one more time, then back at Emily, her mind racing through possibilities, trying to reconcile the image in front of her with the information she now held, because nothing about Emily's appearance aligned with what she knew about the name printed there. Nothing about the simple black dress or the quiet entrance matched the influence, the ownership, the power that name carried, and yet the card was real. The recognition was undeniable. A low murmur began to ripple through the crowd, not loud, but enough to signal that the shift was no longer contained. Whispers of confusion, of curiosity, of something closer to realization started to spread. "Who is she?" someone asked again, but this time the question held weight, not mockery. Another voice followed, softer, more cautious. "I have heard that name before." Victoria took a small step back, almost imperceptible, but enough to break the illusion of control she had maintained all evening. Her posture remained upright, her expression composed, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something far more fragile, the need to understand before she lost everything in front of these people who had watched her lead, who had followed her cues, who were now watching to see if she still held the authority she claimed. Emily finally moved, not stepping forward, not retreating, just a slight shift in her stance, a subtle change that drew even more attention to her presence. She reached out and gently took the card back from Victoria's hand, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, and in that simple motion the balance of power shifted completely, because it was no longer about what was written on the card, it was about who held it. Victoria opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. At first the room waited, the silence pressing in from all sides, as the truth settled into place, not all at once, but but in fragments and realizations in the dawning awareness that the person they had dismissed, the person they had mocked, was not who they thought she was and never had been, and in that moment the night no longer belonged to Victoria Hayes. It belonged to Emily Carter and everyone in that room was about to understand exactly why. It was in the silence that followed that the truth began to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that moved through the room like a slow wave. Emily Carter did not raise her voice. She did not announce anything. She simply stood there holding that small card as if it had never been anything more than what it was, and yet now it carried the weight of something far greater. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came softer than before, controlled, but no longer sharp. "I think there must be some mistake," she said carefully, her words measured as she glanced briefly at the surrounding guests, as if seeking confirmation that the balance had not truly shifted, that she still held the center of the room. But no one responded the same way they had just minutes ago. The smiles were gone, replaced with attentive silence, the kind given not to her, but to Emily, the kind reserved for someone whose importance had just been realized too late. Emily tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, not in arrogance, but in quiet acknowledgement. "There is no mistake," she said, her tone even almost gentle, and that was all it took. Those 4 words settled into the room with more force than any raised voice could have carried, because they left no room for interpretation, no space for denial. Victoria's fingers curled slightly at her sides, her posture still poised, but her composure now held together by effort rather than instinct. She glanced once more at the card in Emily's hand, then back at her face, searching for some sign, some inconsistency that would allow her to regain control, but there was none. Emily's calm was not an act, it was certainty. And certainty is something that cannot be challenged easily. A man near the bar cleared his throat, quietly stepping forward, just enough to be heard. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly, "Ms. Carter, you would not happen to be connected to Carter Holdings, would you?" The question landed like a spark in dry air. Several heads turned sharply, others leaned in closer, the name now circulating through the room with growing recognition. Emily's gaze shifted briefly toward him, then back to Victoria before answering. "Simply, I am the majority owner." The words were not loud, they were not emphasized, but they carried through the room with absolute clarity, and in the next second, everything changed. The murmurs grew louder, no longer whispers of judgment, but fragments of realization. Carter Holdings, the foundation, the development contracts, the building itself. Pieces began to fall into place in rapid succession, and with each realization the atmosphere shifted further away from where it had started. Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but enough for those closest to see the moment. She understood the full weight of what had just been revealed. This was not just a guest. This was not someone who had slipped past a list. This was the person whose name was tied to the very space they were standing in, the very event she had been hosting, the very night she believed she controlled. And now that control was gone, not taken, not forced, but simply dissolved under the truth. Emily took a slow step forward, not toward Victoria specifically, but into the space that had once been occupied by her authority. And as she did, the room adjusted instinctively. People moved slightly, giving her space, not out of instruction, but out of recognition. The guard who had moments ago been ready to escort her out now stood respectfully to the side, his attention fixed, waiting not for orders from Victoria, but from Emily. Victoria opened her mouth again, but whatever she intended to say faded before it could form. Because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to correct. The narrative had already shifted, and she was no longer the one guiding it. Emily looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far more unsettling, understanding, as if she had seen this moment long before it arrived, as if she knew exactly how easily power built on perception could disappear. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but unmistakable in the stillness. "I believe this is my event, Victoria." And just like that, the room went completely silent. The silence that followed did not break immediately. It lingered, stretching across the room like something fragile, yet undeniable. Every guest felt it, the shift, the weight, the realization settling into place. Emily Carter did not move again. She did not need to. Her presence alone now held the room in a way Victoria had only moments ago controlled with ease. Victoria stood still, her mind racing through every possible way to recover, but there was none. The foundation of her authority had been built on perception, on influence, on the belief that she belonged at the top. And now that belief had been quietly dismantled in front of everyone who mattered. One of the guests near The center adjusted his stance, clearing his throat as if attempting to recalibrate the situation. Ms. Carter, he said carefully, his tone respectful now, entirely different from the dismissive murmurs earlier. I was not aware you would be attending tonight. Emily turned her gaze toward him, acknowledging the shift without reacting to it. I prefer to observe before I introduce myself, she replied, simply, her words calm, but carrying meaning that echoed deeper than their surface suggested. A few people exchanged glances, the implication clear. She had been there long enough to witness everything, long enough to see who they really were. When they thought no one important was watching, Victoria felt it, then not just embarrassment, but something far more unsettling, the awareness that this moment would not disappear when the night ended, that the people around her would remember not just what had happened, but how she had handled it. Her posture remained upright, but the ease was gone, replaced by a careful stillness, as if any sudden movement might make things worse. Emily took another step forward, not hurried, not forceful, but enough to subtly redefine the center of the room. The band had stopped playing completely. Now the soft background music gone, replaced by a quiet that made every small sound noticeable, the faint clink of glass, the shifting of fabric, the quiet intake of breath from someone realizing just how quickly the night had changed. Victoria finally spoke again, though her voice lacked the sharp certainty it once held. If there has been a misunderstanding, she began, choosing her words with precision, we can certainly address it privately. Emily did not interrupt. She allowed the sentence to finish, allowed the attempt to regain control to fully form before responding. There was no misunderstanding, she said gently, her tone even but firm. What you said was very clear. The words were not accusatory, they were not raised, but they carried a quiet finality that left no room for reinterpretation. Victoria's expression tightened just slightly, and for the first time, she looked not at Emily, but at the people around her, searching for support, for alignment. But what she found instead was distance, subtle but unmistakable. The same people who had laughed moments ago now stood silent, their attention fixed on Emily, their expressions cautious, recalculating. Because in a room like this, loyalty followed power, and power had shifted. Emily let the silence sit just long enough for that truth to settle before continuing, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. This event, she said slowly, was meant to bring people together, not to measure who belongs and who does not. Her words moved through the room, not as a lecture, but as a reflection of what everyone had just witnessed, and in that reflection, many saw themselves more clearly than they expected. Victoria lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, her composure returning in fragments, though not as strong as before. I did not realize, she began, but the sentence faltered before it could complete, because realization had never been the issue, assumption had, and that difference now stood exposed in front of everyone. Emily did not press further, she did not need to. She simply held the moment, allowing the weight of it to do what confrontation could not. The room remained still, the hierarchy rewritten, not through force, not through argument, but through truth. And in that quiet shift, everyone understood that this night would not be remembered for its elegance or its luxury, but for the moment when everything changed. Without a single raised voice, the room did not return to normal, because there was no normal to return to. The illusion that had once held everything together had already dissolved, and now every person present was adjusting, recalculating where they stood in relation to the quiet woman at the center. Emily Carter did not seek attention, yet attention settled on her naturally, as if the room itself had decided where its focus belonged. A man near the front straightened his jacket, stepping forward with a respectful nod. Ms. Carter, it is an honor to finally meet you. I have followed Carter Holdings for years. The innovation alone has reshaped entire sectors. His voice carried sincerity, not performance, and others quickly followed, one after another, subtle shifts in posture, tone, and expression spreading through the crowd like a chain reaction. The same people who had whispered now spoke, carefully choosing their words, aware that every sentence mattered. Victoria watched it unfold, each interaction, each acknowledgement, each shift in loyalty, and for the first time that evening, she was no longer part of the center. She was on the outside of it, looking in. Her hands remained steady at her sides, but her thoughts moved quickly, searching for a way to regain some measure of control, or at least dignity within the moment. Emily acknowledged each person with a simple nod, nothing excessive, nothing theatrical, just enough to show she heard them, but not enough to encourage anything beyond what was necessary, because this was never about recognition for her. It was about clarity, about letting people reveal themselves without interference. The guard who had once approached her now stood a few feet back, his posture attentive, his role quietly redefined, without a single instruction given. The band members exchanged uncertain glances before slowly resuming a soft melody, the music hesitant at first, as if testing whether the room would accept it again. Conversations began to return, but they were different now, quieter, more measured, lacking the effortless confidence that had filled the space earlier, because everyone understood something had changed permanently. A woman near Victoria leaned closer, whispering, "We did not know," her voice careful, but the distance in her tone unmistakable. Victoria gave a slight nod, though her gaze remained fixed ahead, the weight of the moment pressing against her composure, not breaking it, but reshaping it into something more restrained. Emily took a slow look around the room, not searching, not judging, simply observing the faces, the reactions, the subtle shifts in energy, as if committing it all to memory, not for retaliation, not for leverage, but for understanding, because moments like this revealed more than introductions ever could. She then turned slightly toward the bar, reaching for a glass of water instead of champagne, a small choice, but one that drew quiet attention again, because it reinforced what many were beginning to realize: she was not here to perform status. She already existed beyond it. Victoria finally stepped forward again, not with the same confidence as before, but with intention, measured, controlled. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice steady though softer than earlier, "I would like to apologize if my words were inappropriate." The sentence was carefully constructed, each word placed with precision, designed to acknowledge without fully surrendering, and in another setting it might have worked, it might have restored balance, but here in this moment, it only highlighted how much had already been lost. Emily turned her gaze toward her, listening fully, without interruption, without reaction, until the silence stretched just long enough to make every person in the room aware of it. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, unchanged from the beginning of the night. "I am not concerned with apologies," she said simply, the words landing gently, but with unmistakable clarity. "What matters is what people choose to reveal when they believe no one is watching." The room went still again, not because of volume, not because of confrontation, but because of truth. And in that quiet space, every person present understood that what had been revealed tonight could not be undone and would not be forgotten. No one spoke immediately after Emily's words settled into the room, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to defend. The truth had already done its work, and now it lingered in the silence, shaping every thought, every reaction, every quiet realization unfolding behind composed expressions. Victoria stood still, her posture refined, but no longer commanding. Her presence now carried a different weight, not authority, but awareness, the kind that comes when control slips, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet, irreversible shift around her. The guests adjusted again, not abruptly, but subtly. Conversations resumed in low, careful tones, but they no longer revolved around her. They moved around Emily, orbiting a new center that had formed without announcement, without effort. A man near the far end of the room leaned toward his colleague, speaking under his breath, but not quietly enough to go unnoticed. "I told you Carter Holdings had someone behind the scenes, someone who does not attend publicly." The colleague nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Emily. "She has been here the entire time, watching." The realization spread, not as gossip, but as understanding, each person now reevaluating every glance, every word they had witnessed earlier, because what had seemed insignificant before now carried consequence. Emily remained composed, her attention drifting briefly toward the large windows overlooking the city lights beyond the glass. The skyline stretched wide, illuminated, steady, unchanged by what had just occurred inside. And yet within this room, everything had shifted. She took a small sip of water, then lowered the glass, her movements unhurried, grounded, as if she had all the time in the world. And in that calm, she held something no one else could claim: certainty, not the kind that demanded recognition, but the kind that made recognition inevitable. Victoria finally moved again, not toward Emily this time, but slightly to the side, creating space, not just physically, but symbolically. The center she had once occupied no longer belonged to her, and she understood that now more clearly than anyone else. She glanced around the room, taking in the changed dynamics, the redirected attention, the subtle distance that had formed between her and those who had once followed her lead. One of her closest associates stepped closer, speaking quietly, "We can still recover this if we handle it carefully." But Victoria did not respond immediately. because deep down she knew this was not something that could be managed or redirected. This was something that had already been decided the moment Emily chose to remain silent earlier, the moment she allowed everything to unfold exactly as it had. Emily turned back toward the room, her gaze moving across the faces, not searching for validation, not measuring reactions, but acknowledging the shift with quiet acceptance. She stepped forward once more, not to reclaim anything, not to assert dominance, but simply because the space now opened naturally around her. The band's music grew slightly steadier, no longer hesitant, but still softer than before, as if even the musicians understood that this was no longer an ordinary evening. A woman near the entrance approached slowly, her voice respectful. "Ms. Carter, I would like to personally welcome you. I believe we have not had the opportunity to meet before." Emily offered a small nod, polite but restrained. "I appreciate that," she replied, and in that brief exchange the difference was clear. She did not seek to extend the moment. She did not encourage further attention. She simply accepted what was given and moved forward. Victoria watched this closely, the ease, the restraint, the control that did not rely on display, and in that observation she recognized something she had not considered before. True influence did not need to announce itself. It did not need to be defended. It simply existed and revealed itself when necessary. Emily's gaze returned to her once more, not lingering, not challenging, just present. And in that presence, there was no anger, no satisfaction, only clarity, as if she had already moved beyond the moment, while everyone else was still processing it. And as the room slowly adjusted to this new reality, one thing became unmistakably clear: the night would continue. The music would play, the conversations would resume, but nothing would return to what it had been before, because once truth enters a room, it does not leave quietly, it stays, shaping everything that follows. By the time the music returned to its full rhythm, the night had already been rewritten, not in sound, not in light, but in memory, the kind that lingers long after the last guest leaves. Emily Carter stood near the center of the room, now not because she claimed it, but because the room had quietly given it to her. Conversations continued, but every tone carried a trace of awareness, a carefulness that had not existed before. People chose their words differently, measured their expressions, adjusted their posture, because they understood something they had not understood when the night began. Respect was not assigned by appearance, it was revealed by truth. Victoria Hayes remained composed, her posture still elegant, her expression controlled, but the shift within her was undeniable. She had not lost everything, she had lost something far more subtle, the unquestioned certainty that she belonged above everyone else. She stepped forward once more, this time without performance, without an audience in mind, just a quiet intention to close what had been open. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice steady, "I appreciate your presence tonight." Emily turned toward her, listening fully, her expression unchanged. "I misjudged the situation," Victoria continued, choosing her words carefully, "and for that I take responsibility." It was not an apology designed to impress, it was not perfect, but it was honest. And in that honesty, there was a quiet attempt to reclaim something, not power, not control, but dignity. Emily studied her for a brief moment, not judging, not weighing, but simply understanding the difference between words spoken for appearance and words spoken from realization. Then she gave a small nod, acknowledgement, without endorsement, acceptance, without elevation, the kind that leaves room for growth, but does not erase what has already been revealed around them. The guests watched, not openly, not obviously, but attentively, because this final exchange mattered. It would define how the night settled into memory. Whether it ended in tension or understanding. Emily took a slow breath, then spoke, her voice calm, carrying easily through the softened atmosphere. "People do not reveal who they are when everything is comfortable," she said. "They reveal themselves in moments like this, when they believe it does not matter." Her words were not directed at Victoria alone. They moved through the entire room, touching every person who had whispered, who had laughed, who had watched without speaking. And in that shared understanding, there was no need for further explanation. Victoria lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, her composure steadier, now not restored to what it was, but reshaped into something quieter, something more aware. The distance between them remained, but it was no longer defined by superiority, it was defined by understanding. Emily turned slightly, her attention moving beyond the moment, beyond the tension, toward the broader space of the evening. She picked up her glass again, taking a small sip, then placing it back down, her movements as composed as they had been from the beginning, because for her this was never about proving anything, it was about allowing the truth to surface on its own terms, one by one. The Guests resumed their conversations more naturally, now though never quite the same. The laughter returned, but softer. The confidence rebuilt, but more carefully. The hierarchy that had once been so rigid now carried a subtle awareness that it could shift at any moment, given the right truth, the right presence, the right person. Emily took a final look around the room, not with ownership, not with satisfaction, but with quiet closure, as if marking the end of something unseen. And when she turned to walk toward the far side of the hall, no one stopped her, no one questioned her path. They simply watched, some with respect, some with reflection, some with the quiet discomfort of lessons learned too late. And as the night continued, the lights still bright, the music still playing, one thing remained certain in every mind present: that evening they would remember this moment, not for the elegance, not for the luxury, but for the silence that followed. A simple truth, and that silence would stay with them far longer than anything else, because on that night they did not just meet Emily Carter, they remembered what dignity looks like.